auditorium this evening. I'd like to acknowledge that I, along with all of us here in the auditorium, as well as some of you online, are on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. Some of you may be joining us from other traditional territories. As we continue our work on reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge, respect, and reaffirm our relationship with our First Nations and Métis ancestors, and to all the Indigenous peoples in Canada who have given us the privilege of using these lands. I wish everyone safe, fruitful, and respectful encounters in these territories and homelands. The Keenan Lecture is STM's signature academic event, and we are very happy to be able to hold this lecture in person as well as to live stream the lecture. The Keenan Lecture commemorates and celebrates the life and achievements of Dr. Michael Keenan, who was born in 1937 and died in 1986. Mike completed a BA and master's degree in psychology at Assumption University in Windsor, Ontario in the early 60s, after which he worked for the Ontario government for a year assisting patients at the psychiatric hospital in St. Thomas. Mike then taught developmental psychology for 2 years at King's College, now King's University College, which is affiliated with the University of Western Ontario. Mike first came to STM on the invitation of Father Peter Swan in 1965, who was serving as the principal of STM at that time. Father Swan had been at Assumption University a few years earlier as its registrar, which is how he knew Mike. However, after 2 years at STM, Mike and his wife Pat and their young family went back to Ontario so that he could pursue his doctoral studies in psychology at the University of Waterloo. He taught sessionally as a graduate student in developmental psychology while he finished his graduate work. When he finished his PhD, he came back to STM, and that was in 1971. In addition to teaching courses in developmental psychology, he served as head of the psychology department, and within 4 years was appointed as the dean, the first dean of STM. He served in that role from 1975 to 1985. Throughout his years as dean, Mike remained dedicated to his students, and he loved teaching in his field of child psychology. He was known for his quiet leadership, the quiet leadership that he provided to STM, for his insistence on high academic standards, and for the humor and affability which characterized both his public and private life. Pat, along with one of their 3 children, as well as some grandchildren, have remained in Saskatoon, and they have become a part of the life of the college. We are very fortunate to have Pat with us here this evening. Thank you for being here so much, Pat. We just had a lovely supper together. And as you know, we have other members, well, you might know, but there are a number of other members that are likely joining us online watching the lecture. To commemorate Mike's close bond with STM, the Keenan family, Pat, along with Mike's twin brother Robert, with the assistance of STM's Board of Governors and some faculty at the time, established this annual lecture. The lecture takes place each fall on a date close to the anniversary of Mike's death, which is October 31st. And we have been privileged to listen to leading intellectuals and leaders from various fields since the first lecture in 1987. Through all these years, this lecture has become a celebration not only of Mike Keenan's service and dedication to the college, but also of the Keenan family's commitment to what our college stands for, an intellectual synthesis of faith and reason. It has been the mission of this lecture to invite scholars to give presentations that explore this relationship. In that sense, Pat and her family have remained an essential part of the STM family and its mission. For that, we are very grateful, Pat. And as we have done in the past, so again, it'll come as no surprise, we have a small token of our appreciation for you and your family. Thanks again, Pat and the Keenan family. Dr. Monica Wong, who's a faculty member in STM's Sociology Department, will now introduce our 34th Michael Keenan Memorial Lecture. Monica, thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Michele Dillon, our distinguished guest speaker for the 34th Keenan Memorial Lecture. Dr. Dillon currently serves as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Class of 1944 Professor of Sociology at the University of New Hampshire. She earned her BA in Social Science an MA in Sociology at University College Dublin in Ireland, and her PhD in Sociology at the University of California-Berkeley in the United States. Michele's work is remarkable for her comprehensive study and rigorous analysis of issues related to contemporary Catholicism, and this research has been supported by grants from the John Templeton Foundation, the Louisville Institute, the Fetzer Institute, and the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. The breadth of Michele's work shows a vital and varied focus, capturing the complexities of modern Catholicism. Michele, who has published over 50 articles and book chapters, has written extensively about topics such as postsecular Catholicism, Catholic identity, and the moral question of divorce in Ireland. Her co-authored monograph, In the Course of a Lifetime, Tracing Religious Belief, Practice, and Change, was named by Choice as an outstanding title of 2007. Michele is also actively engaged in public sociology by lending her expertise to international media and other forums to speak about and interpret the significance of religious issues in everyday social life. Dr. Dillon has served as president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, chair of the American Sociological Association section on the sociology of religion, and president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion. For her contributions to the field of sociology and religion, Michele has received many accolades, such as being appointed the J.E. and Lillian Byrne-Tipton Distinguished Visiting Professorship in Catholic Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Michele Dillon as our special guest.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Monica, for that beautiful introduction, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for my water, Lorna. It's my great pleasure to be here this evening to present the 34th Michael Keenan Memorial Lecture. And I'm very honoured to have received this wonderful invitation from Dean Tammy Marsh from the Keenan Lecture Advisory Committee, and I want to especially acknowledge them. I also want to thank Laura Mitchell, who has been so attentive to all the many, many details associated with my trip. And I want to thank in particular Pat Keenan and the Keenan family for their endowment of this lecture and others who continue to support it. With respect, I would also like to acknowledge that St. Thomas More College is on Treaty 6 lands, Nahiwa territory, and the homeland of the Métis. I respect and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. In preparing for my visit, I was humbled to read about the history of St. Thomas More and the remarkable trajectory of its evolution from a visionary idea of local Catholics in 1913 seeking to integrate Catholic faith into higher education, to its evolution into being actually established here as a college by the Basilian Fathers and ultimately federated with the University of Saskatchewan. I marveled at the college's growth and how proactively adaptive it was to changing times. I note in particular how the governance structure changed, particularly in the early 1970s, paving the way for the inclusion of lay faculty, non-Catholics and non-Saskatchewan residents, and of course the appointment of Dr. Michael Keenan as its first dean in 1975. It is truly an honour for me to participate in recalling Dean Keenan's legacy as Dean Marsh articulated, especially at a time when liberal arts at multiple institutions across Canada, the US and in Europe are under multiple threats, and the value of our liberal arts education is increasingly questioned. Yet the complexities and uncertainties of the present moment, fueled by the war in Ukraine, the terror in the Middle East, intensified geopolitical conflicts, resurging authoritarianism, poverty, climate change, and the spectre of generative AI displacing human creativity, illuminate how necessary it is for people to be taught and to learn to develop the habits of heart, the disciplined habits of heart and mind that empower independent thinking and thoughtful civic engagement both locally and nationally. So I, again, thank you all for this wonderful invitation. Now turning to the topic at hand, can post-secular society rekindle the common good? The readiness to tackle the immense challenges, some of which I've just articulated, that mark our current era, are severely undermined by the political polarization that is so dominant, particularly in some societies, especially I will call out the US, but also locally and across several other nations. Just looking at this slide, and this is from a Pew Forum public opinion survey, across national survey, and it's basically asking the question of ordinary residents across several different countries. You see US, Canada, Australia, UK, Germany, France, and Spain, asking them a question about whether global climate change, whether they see global climate change as a serious threat to their country. And as you see, which is in a sense in a surprise, that this is so politicized by people's affiliation, or at least their leaning, whether they're more on the right leaning, and of course what that means varies depending on which country you're in. But overall, it's looking that, for example, in the US, 22% of right-leaning, which in the US would be Republicans, compared to 85% of Democrats, believe that climate change is a major threat. That's a hugely significant gap. The gap certainly is less in Canada, as you see, but still substantial, a 34% difference. Similarly, Australia, 44%, and to some extent too in Germany. And some of you will remember that Germany back in the 1970s was really one of the first countries to be talking about environmental conservation and about change. And yet even in Germany we see that right-wing versus left-wing politics, and those are not necessarily very good categories or labels to use, but you get the drift of, depending on the various political stripes in a country at a given time, that one's leanings does matter to how you perceive the world. And I'm showing this for climate change, but you can see this for all kinds of other issues as well. And indeed, the idea that we might be able to discover an overlapping consensus on climate change or any of the other issues that are increasingly pervasive and increasingly visible may in fact seem a little naive, particularly given the rise of neoliberalism, the declining significance of the state, even in societies where it had a much more proactive and communal role. And that sometimes it seems today that the idea of individual and social well-being, never mind the notion of the common good, is a little old-fashioned. And so what tonight I'm hoping to do is to rekindle your interest in the common good, even if, as I'm sure we'll get to towards the Q&A, if not during the talk, that perhaps it is more, maybe it's naive on my part too to be talking about it. I know there's going to be questions at the end, but it's also that Chris will moderate, but it's also fine to interrupt or ask a question as I go along, I feel. So the notion of the common good, is, as some of you or many of you know, is a central tenet to Catholicism. And as the Catechism defines it, it's the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. The idea of the common good has been elaborated publicly by papal encyclicals going back to the late 19th century. The rise of industrialization, urbanism, the huge societal transformation, and really the expansion of capitalism and democracy. And the Catholic Church, the popes in particular, but also local bishops and national bishops' conferences have had a consistent emphasis on this, no matter what topic it is that they're talking about. Really, it's an emphasis on the inherent dignity of the individual, and that each individual really has to be treated with all the due respect that inheres in their God-given inalienable rights. And so among its general ideas are the advancement of prosperity, because it's recognizing that we do live in a world where material goods matter, and that the individual and community well-being has to be ensured. So, for example, the church has been a friend of labour, if you will, since the late 19th century, always talking about the idea of what we call today a just wage or a living wage, right? It's not just the minimum wage, but it has to be a wage that is livable for the individual and typically also for a family, with access to education and healthcare. Also an emphasis on political stability and security and the promotion of peace. That has been a consistent and constant theme, and as we recognize today is still sadly a very essential need in our global society. And while in particular it's the duty of individuals and groups and everyone's duty to promote the common good, Catholic teaching tends to see a special emphasis on the role of the state in doing so and of social institutions more generally. So it's not to let individuals off the hook, but it's also to recognize the political importance of the state and the state's social institutions. And of course that is a notion that is quite limited depending on the political context. And as we see the differences between Canada and the US, for example, in the role of the state as a proactive facilitator of the common good or of social development, as opposed to, say, also then in Europe, but even in Europe, the notion of the welfare state, which was a very positive notion starting in the 50s and down through really into the 80s and 90s, has in the last couple of decades also become diluted. So again, context matters. It's very dynamic, it evolves, but clearly the trend is away, no matter what country you look at, away from this notion that the state does have a major responsibility to ensure the common good of all. It's not just a Catholic ethic, it's also found in several democratic and republican ethos. In particular, I call out Robert Bellah, a Canadian-born sociologist who worked at Berkeley for many years. In best-selling books, Habits of the Heart, for example, some of you might have read that. It came out in the mid-1980s. He talked a lot about he's a little alarmed, he and his co-authors, about how American society was becoming excessively individualistic. So, of course, individualism is a major strand in American and a lot of Western democratic societies. But he and his co-authors were concerned as they looked around that people were becoming excessively oriented on the self, the rise of the therapeutic self, which we know we could have a whole talk about that probably another time. But his basic concern was to sort of retrieve the other strands in American culture. And one of those strong strands is that of community responsibility, the responsibility of the self towards the community well-being. And that therefore, and he uses many good historical examples that even despite fractures and differences in American history from earliest times, nonetheless, he was optimistic that people were able to come together and find an overlapping consensus despite divergent backgrounds and interests. And as you see in the quote here, the individual self finds its fulfillment in relationships with others in a society organized through public dialogue. The necessary dialogue can be sustained only by what he calls communities of memory, whether religious or civic. And so when we talk about a community of memory, we can think of Catholicism as a community of memory, shared rituals, shared beliefs, shared set of practices, to a large extent a shared sensibility of what does it mean to be Catholic. But you can have a community of memory in any other religious tradition and also within a political tradition or whatever it is. But it has to have a history, it has to have a tradition, it has to have an objective set of ethics that propel us to behave in certain kinds of ways. And when Bellah and his co-authors were writing Habits of the Heart, and then they had a second follow-up, and both of those were national bestsellers, it was called The Good Society. One of the things that they were very concerned about was what they saw as the decline of religion in the US, because the church, the local church, was seen historically, as it was in many other parts of the world, as an anchor of community, not just of national community, but locally, and as a source of civic infrastructure. And writing in the 80s, they were looking around and feeling that people were more concerned about going to see a therapist than going to see a religious figure or to be in dialogue with others within their community. And in a sense, he was quite right, in some sense, at least he was seeing the right trend. As you hopefully can see from this graph, one of the major trends in American society, we might think of America, with all due respect to all of us who are not American, we might think of it as really the most advanced, modern, progressive society. One of the interesting things about the US is that religion has kept such a strong hold, whatever religion, on the American imagination, in American culture, for so many decades, even as it has disappeared in other societies. But you see on this graph here that starting in the 1990s, there's been a tremendous decrease in religious affiliation in America. I mean, it's really quite stunning. In sociology, we track public opinion and public values and attitudes about a lot of things. And it's typical to see shifts in opinion, but not to the consistent acceleration of increase here that you see over really basically 20 years or so. And it keeps increasing. So that today in America, almost a third of people, less than a third, are, when they're asked by Pew Research Centers and others, what, if any, is your religion? A large group, it's still under half, obviously it's almost a third, say they have no religion. And initially pollsters thought that this may be a function of the way the question was asked. And so then they had a follow-up question, well, is it no religion now because you're looking or you're shopping for a religion? And people were very quick to answer, no, I've no religion, I'm not affiliated anywhere. And when you see this, this is quite a very interesting graph, a trend. And if you look at that by age, which I'm not going to do it, if you look at the younger generation, the 20-something generation, you'll see it's about over 40% who have no religious affiliation. So you see that there's definitely increased secularization, increased decline of religion in the US. Nonetheless, as this photograph captures from a different era, church exit ahead, caution, this photo, this is actually from Ireland from many years ago, when church was a source of traffic. That's no longer the case there. But when you look at secularization, just that trend that I show you of the decline in religious affiliation, that's not necessarily total secularism. If you're able to see this graph here, secularization is invariably and almost always uneven, right? So if you can see that, and by the way, this is going to be, this will be printed, some copies of this, so you can see it all on a physical copy after the fact. But you see the red here is when you ask people, does being religious make people a better citizen? And you see that actually even in France, even in Canada, no matter which country it is, a lot of people still believe that that's true, that there's something about the morality or the ethics of religion that can anchor people into some kind of morality. The blue there is the percent who say that my religion defines me. Now that's a pretty declarative statement, but nonetheless, there's quite a few percentages, no matter what country you look at there, who say that. And then if you look at the green, it's the church monthly. Yes, the Americans at the bottom go the most frequently, 28% report going to church at least once a month. In Canada, of course, it's a little less, it's 18%, but what we see is that even though we think of several of these countries like France and the UK and Canada to some extent, and I know it depends on the region or the province, as secular societies, and increasingly I'm showing that America is a secular society, religion still matters. It still matters, so it hasn't disappeared. And it still defines people. People still practice to some extent. There's often a variation in how they interpret what it means to practice, but there's still a lot of vestiges of religion in the society. And so this raises the issue, and this I'm going to have about 6 slides on this, so bear with me. But how did we get, and this goes to the title of my talk, from modernity to what now some of us are calling, and many sociologists and others, people in literary studies, people in arts, are calling the postsecular. And before I get to the slide that tells you what the postsecular is, let me just give you the preview, which is the postsecular doesn't mean that secularism has disappeared. It means that we've gone beyond secularism into a new formation where the religious and the secular are mattering together, are equally relevant, and need to be in dialogue together. So the post doesn't mean that religion, that secularization has never happened. It has happened, it is happening, but nonetheless there's a place for religion. So that's the post-secular. And the two can be in dialogue together, not to privilege one over the other. And I'll quickly go through this idea that the Enlightenment principles, which are the founding principles of modern democracy, for example, the elevation of reason and rational thinking, the understanding that the individual is endowed with reason and therefore can be self-governing. This was a radical idea of the Enlightenment philosophers, and as we saw, it went down into all of the whole rise of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, sovereignty of nations, of peoples, that if people are born with reason and endowed with reason, they should have the authority, not to take authority from kings and queens or popes, but from the will of the people, voting, for example. So the elevation also of science and rational thought, right? This emphasis that we don't believe something on faith, but we believe something when we see the positive scientific evidence that X is equal to Y, or whatever it is we would be putting into our formula. And it really, as part of this emphasis on reason, on rationality, on science, was the associated view that religion would inevitably decline because it's about the non-rational, it's about things that you can't see, it's about things that have mystery. And what Enlightenment thinking and modernity was supposed to do was to disenchant us, was to take away mystery and show us instead the cold rationality of life. Yet we know that all of this hasn't quite lived up to the promise of Enlightenment thinking. As I've just shown with the earlier graph, religion, despite secularization, has not disappeared in Western modernity. Religion still matters to some extent in all societies in the West. And more importantly, perhaps, reason and science has not solved all of our societal problems, in fact, has contributed to those. So going back to the polarization question, the polarization issue on climate change, if we have all this access to great science and are able to measure, and that's the value of science, if we can measure things, we can track things over time, we know we have a lot of scientific data that climate change is devastating to communities, to the planet, but it hasn't really been solved by scientists or by us. The same, we can look at poverty. There's hundreds of studies showing how poverty is transmitted intergenerationally. We can have beautiful graphs documenting that with fancy statistical modeling. But science has not been able to solve those problems. And similarly, whether the polarization I referenced or cultural exclusion. So these are the failures of modernity, but Jürgen Habermas, whom I referenced, he's a famous German social theorist who's still alive. He must be close to 90. And he's a big proponent of the Enlightenment, and for years wrote about the rational public square, and in fact was being very critical about religion, because he really saw religion as a vestige of tradition and as something that would undermine the rationality of individuals. But he has since come to reassess his own beliefs there. And his assessment is that modernity itself hasn't failed, so he wants us to still keep the modernity lens. He's not saying it's postmodern and that the modern has evolved into something different. He's saying we have to reassess modernity because reason has been distorted in how it's been used. We use reason to manipulate, whether it's with economic issues, whether it's with scientific issues, that we have focused too much on the instrumental parts of reason rather than on the values, the normative and the substantive values piece that reason and public conversation among reasoned individuals can help produce. And just to elaborate a little more on science, I mean, this is not a new idea. And of course, in the last few years, there's been a lot of discourse, are you pro-science or anti-science, which, that comes out of a very particular political moment, but which is really a misguided question and answer, I guess. Max Weber, one of the great founding people of sociology, had long ago articulated that science cannot tell us what values to prioritize, right? Scientific pleading is meaningless because there's so many different value spheres. His nice language, different gods or different groups of values struggle with one another. And he was talking about, and for all times to come. And he was writing really the beginning of the 20th century when there was an awful lot of optimism about science and how science can really rescue us and emancipate us and advance societal progress, but he had a more pessimistic view, or a more, you could argue, prescient view, that science is wonderful, but science cannot tell us how to live our lives. And our fate, our political fate, our individual human fate in a collective community is to decide which, as he says, of the warring gods to serve. We have to make principled values choices about what we want to do, because science, all the science in the world, won't solve our problems. It's up to the political will of people to solve those problems. And in looking at this, he said only prophets or religious individuals and political leaders, but I left that off the slide for today, can help us with this task. It's not bureaucrats or scientists, because they're supposed to value neutrality, whereas religious leaders and people of faith have commitment to particular values, and so they can argue for those values, and then people can assess whether they're persuaded by those arguments based on the science and based on other commitments as well. And so that's why Habermas calls for what he calls a contrite modernity. And I captured a notion of a contrite modernity by reminding you of the confession box, because I never know what the audience is, but long ago and still today, the confession, and those who are socialized in Catholicism, you know that a contrite heart is a good thing. You have to reflect on your failures. You have to discern what those failures are. And you have to make a commitment to try to do better. So you don't have to despair. That's the wonderful thing about the sacrament of confession. You get the grace to do better, even if you have to come back 2 weeks repeating the same sins, whether sins of omission or sins of commission. But nonetheless, Habermas is calling for a contrite modernity, that we recognize the failures of modernity, that we have these problems of inequality, whether it's economic equality, cultural inequality, we have these problems of climate change, etc., and try to seek to remedy these societal ills. And of course, obviously, the failures of political security across the world, as we see with all of the wars today. So he's calling for a contrite modernity, that we try to do better as we move forward. And in looking at this contrite modernity, we get to post-secular society. It's not quite as linear as I'm making it out, and probably those colors looked nice when I was doing them, but it's basically contrite modernity, as I just said, requires a new awareness of religion, that religion, in a sense, the persistence of religion is part of the failure of the Enlightenment, because the promise that it would go away is not true, as I've shown. But at the same time, secularization is the settled reality, right? Most people are not going to church in most contexts, or believing in God or in religion. Nonetheless, religion is still relevant. So it's on the one hand, on the other, it's keeping all of these things together, holding them together, rather than seeing them in contradiction. And it's also, which really is the purpose, in a sense, of why I want to talk about this, it's the affirmation of the potential public usefulness of moderate religion in helping to reorient a contrite society. Right? So can we delve into what he sees as the long-standing ethics, values, and the affectual, and people have an emotional connection to religion. Can those commitments and values be deployed to help a contrite society move toward a better future? And in part, this becomes a possibility because religious ethics transcend and are in tension with many of the material values of our present society. The consumerist society we live in, the consumerist mindset that probably all of us here have to a greater or lesser extent. And religious traditions, and I'm arguing this evening in particular Catholicism, has these ethics that try to pull us away from our immersion in the self and in materialism to try to think of the common good of all. And so that's basically the post-secular. So it's bringing the religious back into the public sphere, so to speak. The religion was supposed to be banned from the public sphere because it would undermine the rationality of public discourse. But now the understanding is not only is religion not always about the non-rational, there's also elements of the rational within religion, of course, but that these non-rational elements can be very valuable to the conversation, as long as they're reasoned, of course, in a particular way. And that they're not just for those who are in a particular religious tradition, but are for the whole of humanity, right? So these, in a sense, transcend any particular faith community, because the ethics themselves are really about humanity. They're really about the common good of all, not just about particular vested interests of one particular group or other. And within this post-secular domain, there's a couple of sort of rules, and this is a little abstract or theoretical, but that secular and religious actors are required to meet each other as equals. And of course, I would first of all point out that, when I show you those data, that so many people, we live in a secular society. Most Catholics, for example, who are still Catholic, a lot of them disagree with lots of aspects of church teaching. Nonetheless, they're still Catholic, so they're intermixing in their own individual lives the press of secular society, along with the pull of being involved, let's say, in Catholicism, in its sacraments, its rituals, its various communities. So there's never a strict dichotomy, in my view. Habermas thinks there is, but there isn't a strict dichotomy between what a religious citizen or actor is and a secular. In today's day and age, the two intermesh in many cases. Some are purely secular, but in many cases, most individuals have some combination, some greater or lesser set of ingredients, if you will, of both the religious and the secular. But in any case, it's this meeting of both, regardless of their views on the religious aspect. And they have to talk with one another, right? So it's not just talking about one another. And of course, we all have a good record of talking about people with whom we disagree. The post-secular wants people to talk with each other. And that's, of course, a high task, it's a tall order, but that really is the ideal that's been set forth. And so secular actors in this mutual exchange of ideas, secular people are required to treat religious ethical claims with respect, not to dismiss them, but to actually consider them, right? Maybe there's a reason why the church really emphasizes the dignity of the individual. And if we unpack that for whatever the particular issue is, whatever the topic is, and we've no shortage of topics that present us with social problems today and political problems, but maybe we can try to get beyond partisan interest to see a way forward for creating a better society. And religious actors themselves have to be open to modernity, so they can't just talk about their own individual faith. They have to be able to translate that into an accessible secular discourse. They have to use words and language that makes sense to those who are not part of their faith community. So, in short, and then we'll get to the next piece, post-secular society offers, in my view, hope for change, that amid all the problems of modernity and of the contemporary world, we can find a way forward. And it rejects the defeatism that sees the problems of modernity as being beyond fixing. I know any day of the week when we watch the news or read the news, you can feel quite defeated because there are just so many problems, really horrendous problems and suffering in the world. But we can't just shake our heads or despair. We have to try and work together in society to find a way forward. And at the same time, we have to recognize that the answer to these problems is not science alone, it's not technical solutions alone, but it calls for the fusion or the infusion and injection of values into the conversation so that we can begin to articulate what kind of a local or national or global community we want to create, if not for the next generation, if not for ourselves. The post-secular the Habermas's talk about post-secular society, I argue, has a nice coincidence with what I call the emergence of a contrite church. The photographs there are both Benedict and Pope Francis. Back in 2010, some of you may have followed this news, got to do with the sex abuse scandals within the church and the priest-sex abuse of children and his cover-up. And Pope Benedict made a very formal public apology for the church's sex abuse scandals, which at the time was seen like as a really important moment, just in how the church presents itself, because depending on your age or what you've read, for a long, long time, the church would never admit to error, because the church was beyond error, above error. And so to actually, even though there's often private apologies, to actually come out loud and formally announce that you actually apologize. He admitted serious, quote, serious mistakes, grave errors of judgment, and failures of leadership on the part of bishops. So that was really quite unusual. That was 2010. And then Pope Francis, skipping to the Pope Francis's now tenure, he has continued Benedict's emphasis that the church needs to engage in reflexive self-critique, what he calls honest self-examination, in an effort toward renewal. And as you all know, he apologized to the indigenous peoples on his pilgrimage to Canada last year. And it's, if you've ever read the actual full address, or maybe some of you were present at it, it's really, quite moving and full of all of that, truly begging for forgiveness for the way in which the church treated indigenous peoples in so many instances, certainly in the residential schools, but in other ways. So and he frequently peppers his statements and encyclicals with apologizing for sort of what he calls the colonial, the spiritual colonization that the church has done in all kinds of sectors. So the church is being contrite in this sense. The church's post-secular capacity, so the post-secular capacity is this ability of the church, and while I'm kind of focusing on church leaders, but it's really all church groups, church individuals, people who are part of any church community can do this. But historically, the Catholic Church as an institution has had a very long history of being a publicly engaged church. I mentioned earlier the long history of papal encyclicals, but also as a global transnational actor, it's well suited to take a broad perspective on things rather than arguing from even within a national perspective or a local perspective. It sees the whole world simultaneously. And of course, it's active as an institution in several domains, in education, obviously, in healthcare, in social services providing, Catholic charities, for example, in media. It's a whole media empire. So it's very active in secular domains, or in domains that are not just the purview of secular institutions. And I would suggest that Pope Francis has, whether intentionally or not, he mightn't agree with this characterization, but he has wholeheartedly embraced a post-secular role in the terms of trying to do all the things that I said, to engage people where they are, to use an open attitude to communication, using a very accessible discourse. And in particular, it's most evident in his writings on climate change and economic inequality. And these are themes, now it's 10 years really of his papacy, that have been to the forefront. And his encyclica that came out, Laudato Si, in 2015, was really a landmark. It wasn't the first time that popes started talking about climate change. Pope Benedict, for example, had written extensively and was often referred to actually as the Green Pope for all of the initiatives he had put forward as Pope. Pope Paul VI talked about the environment and environmental devastation back in the 1960s. He was talking about global human development. But Francis has really been very strong in articulating what the crisis is. And I don't want to take up too much time reading all of these, because I don't know whether you can see them either. But basically, in a nutshell, he says, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis that is both social and environmental. And strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. And that's the crux. He says this in all kinds of ways, but that's the bottom line for him, that climate change, yes, is in and of itself a huge problem, but it's also tied in with economic inequality. So the problems of the poor and of refugees and all of that's because so many of refugees, for example, yes, some are driven away by war, but also by devastation, environmental disasters, for example. And in an interesting turn in Laudato Si, he really talks about the common good. And as far as I know, this is the first time that someone says that the climate is a common good belonging to all and meant for all. So we used to think of trying to build the common good with a focus on human social community, but now Francis is asking us to think of the climate, the whole planet, the natural world, as itself a common good in which we all share. The natural environment is a collective good. If we do not administer it for the good of all, we burden our consciences with the weight of having denied the existence of others. And he calls for responsible stewardship, not what he calls utilitarian dominion, not this instrumental manipulation of the environment for economic development purposes, or so we can have a nice house on the beach or whatever. It's to respect the environment as part of the common good and preserve it. And then he's very clear, and this is where this ethic asks us to go beyond our own immediate interests. Humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat global warming, or at least the human causes that produce or aggravate it. And he was, about a couple of weeks ago, he issued another statement, sort of a follow-up to this statement, and he again repeated that, in fact, the urgency of the environmental crisis is even more serious than he thought 10 years ago when he wrote 2015. So it's not quite 10 years when he wrote Laudato Si. And he called out countries in particular. He blames certainly the Americans, but also all of us. And he says it's up to everyone. Everyone can make a difference, right? And he talks always again, that, he's using rational language. He's talking about scientific consensus. He does this over and over again. He talks about what you'd expect a scientist to say. A very solid scientific consensus indicates that we're presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. Throughout his encyclica and in his most recent document, he references scientific findings as if he's writing a journal article for an environmental magazine or a peer-reviewed journal. So he's very adept at using this kind of reasoned argument from science. But because we know, as I said, science can only go so far. It has limits, particularly in the realm of persuasion. He also makes recourse to poetic reasoning, which brings in the cultural but also the emotional connections that many Catholics, but not just Catholics, many Christians and others have, for example, to St. Francis of Assisi. And he quotes in Laudato Si from the well-known Canticle of St. Francis. And then he makes subsequently, well, into the encyclica, a very nice use of the imagery, the iconography of Mary, the Mother of God, saying, just as her pierced heart mourned the death of Jesus, so now she grieves for the sufferings of the crucified poor and for the creatures of this world laid waste by human power. So yes, we have all the signs, he can quote all the scientific studies, but he also is able to very actively, and I think symbolically, but also persuasively, pull down these figures from within the religious tradition that have meaning way beyond believers themselves. Because St. Francis, even Mary, the Mother of God, whether people believe in Mary, the Mother of God, she's a well-known figure for various reasons. But St. Francis of Assisi is really someone who transcends religion. And as evidence of that, this is an exhibition at the British Gallery in Trafalgar Square this past summer. Any of you who have been to Trafalgar Square know that it is really a monument to the great British Empire. And there they have a beautiful exhibition on St. Francis of Assisi. So I think this is evidence of the post-secular, if ever you wanted evidence, if you thought that all those slides were a little abstract. I found it fascinating that they would have, or it would have, an exhibition on St. Francis. And the very beautiful images, some of the more classical ones that you're used to seeing, and then also some contemporary works, you know, new interpretations of care for nature. And you'll see this in the printed document, but they have, you know, they do the beautiful curation, and they talk about how Francis is such a radical figure and is still relevant for our time because he walked away from wealth and he was for all the poor and for creatures. And I mean, it's just a fantastic celebration of Francis. And at the bottom of this one, it says, he is considered by many to be a patron saint or an ally of causes related to social justice, interreligious dialogue, socialism, feminism, the animal rights movement, and ecology, among others. So in case you didn't know this before, and St. Francis really is quite a phenomenal figure. So, but this is wonderful, because if from the point of view of the post-secular, the religious and the secular being able to have a conversation, making recourse to St. Francis of Assisi and what he stood for, and then deploying him to further persuade people to what we need to do with climate change and other issues, can become a powerful, persuasive strategy. And so in short, I would say that Pope Francis himself, Pope Francis, not St. Francis, has a strong post-secular sensibility, and I can provide more evidence in the paper, which I have, but it's, you know, he's very open. He does not to communicating with anybody. He does not insist on magisterial authority, that because he's Pope, he knows better than anyone else. Quite the contrary, he frequently quotes from all kinds of people, as I say, scientists, from literature, and from all other bishops' conferences and reports. He's very sensitive to local realities, and he emphasizes all the time that realities are more important than ideas. Some of these strands we see very much in evidence during the series of synods he's held. And tomorrow I know I'm meeting some to talk about the current synod, but there's many ways in which we see this openness. But it's really his plain spokenness and how emotionally attuned he is, or seems to be, to so many issues, even as at the same time his words in any of these issues may not necessarily fully create action on them, but it is helping the public discourse and the Catholic discourse to try to be a leader in discussing some of these pressing societal problems, such as climate change. Nonetheless, of course, the reception, like how people receive what they're said, just to give you this one, again, is of course from the US, but what you see here, yes, we always know that Catholics don't think alike, and that's one of the wonderful things about Catholicism, that there's so many strands of opinion. But again, we see here this political polarization, right? That Democrats see that climate change is, you know, caused by human activity, and they thought that in 2015, and they think about it now. But Republicans, exactly the opposite. I mean, yes, again, this big gap. So really today, you know, there was a time, maybe even 20 years ago, when if you knew someone's religion, you could make certain predictive hypotheses about what they might believe about certain political and social issues. But today, religion has totally lost its independent predictive powers as a variable. It's really political affiliation, just like I showed it going back to that first slide on polarization. It's really, if you know someone's political affiliation, then you can predict what they'll believe about an awful lot of things, which may sound, oh, they're very consistent, but given the complexity of all the issues, it seems really a paucity of reason and paucity of reflection and discernment about these issues. There shouldn't be such differences, such easily predicted differences, one would argue, because whether you're right-leaning or left-leaning, you're still living in a complex world with lots of intersecting identities. There's no one that's overarching. Yet when it comes to views on these societal problems or issues, the political framing seems to be the most dominant one. But nonetheless, Francis does have the current post-secular public sphere. I mean, Pope Francis has a certain moral influence which helps motivate political action and certainly the conversation. Back, he was influential in getting people to sign up, the countries on the Paris Climate Agreement. He was on the Clinton Global Initiative, which was a big week of events that coincided in October, or I think maybe it was September this year in New York as part of the UN meetings. He was interviewed as part of that, of the Clinton side. And then there's a lot of Catholic groups, both in Canada, the US, across Europe. The Catholic Climate Covenant, which is sort of has an alliance of various local groups, all working in public protests, but also working locally to try to convince people we need to do something about the environment, as well as, of course, the Pan-Amazonian network in Latin America. But one ironic piece of this, which I don't go into, but in fact, when you talk about the post-secular capacity, which really is the ability to engage those who are non-religious, the non-affiliated, all those people who say they have no religion and are happy having no religion, are most aligned with Francis on climate change, but they're probably not in the habit, just like most Catholics are not in the habit of reading encyclicals. I don't think the religiously unaffiliated would probably be interested too much in reading Pope Francis's, but if they were to read any of his statements on the climate change, they would find such a clear ally, and in fact find arguments that would bolster their own beliefs, but also maybe even give them a few additional ones, such as the common good, for example, that the climate is a common good, that climate change activists and the unaffiliated could use to bolster political action in this realm. So conclusion, I believe that the church does have post-secular credibility. It has a long history of commitment to the common good, but not just an articulated commitment to the common good, but there's actually a lot of consistency in this regard between the church teachings on the common good and its own activism, its own actual institutional practices on social justice broadly defined, and then in more recent years on environmentalism. I will note, however, that there are limits to the church's openness. That's a whole other conversation on the sex and gender issues, which I'm not talking about today. There's certainly limits to that. But nonetheless, there is some potential that maybe the openness that we see in the church's openness on these issues, on the political and economic issues, environmental issues, may actually also nudge a certain back and forth between the secular impacting how the church thinks about sex and gender. And we see that there's some shift in the last few years with some church leaders pointing to greater inclusion, particularly for LGBTQ Catholics and others, but there certainly continues to be limits, as on the issue, for example, of women's ordination. But Francis's ability to be very au fait with secular and scientific reasoning, but also to be able to so naturally deploy the poetic and the emotional connections. And so just finally, yes, the church has multiple voices, multiple interpretive opinions, but this dialogical exchange can only help open up conversation about every topic. And if you believe that open conversation might produce some positive results, that's a very good start. And so in conclusion, basically, I would say that all these tensions notwithstanding, that the church educates. It can still educate. It can be a voice amplifying the common good, and it has to keep doing that if it is to have relevance today, because the trends are declining, more and more secularization, and the church really now has this moment, church leaders, but also people in their local churches, to retrieve a role, a public role for the church as a post-secular actor in this new environment. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions, and Chris will moderate it. So thank you all. Thank you.
Okay, so the approach to moderation will be, this will be like a talking stick. If you raise your hand, I'll bring you the talking stick. And remember that we're trying for that dialogical exchange, so maybe not a lecture from the questioner.
Hi. My name's Dave McGrain. I'm a professor of political studies here. There's one thing I maybe didn't quite understand, or I wanted you to elaborate on more in your talk. It seemed like your ideas around the post-secular society was, I couldn't figure out if this was an ideal that we're going towards a post-secular society, or is this something that's a reality now that we're living in? Or is it maybe somewhere in between? I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about sort of, is this an ideal, is it a reality, or maybe somewhere in between the two right now?
Yeah, great. Now, that's a great question. So I would say that in one hand, it is an ideal, but I would argue that it actually is here. So empirically, if you look at the data, for example, that show that religion still matters, right? We know that it still matters in individual lives. We also know that it still matters institutionally, right? Church is still involved in education and healthcare, all of these things. And so it has to be a player in the larger conversation. And so I would say most people don't know the term, and maybe it's a ridiculous term, and we're always inventing in academia new terms, and but I think what I like about the post-secular is it recognizes that we live in a secular society, right? That's the operating mode, is that it's secular, but nonetheless religion really does matter in a positive way, right? It's not, oh, religion matters, it's a problem. Maybe there is a problem, but religion can have this ethical voice that transcends political and religious partisan interests. But I know when Habermas uses it, he's not using it in the sociological empirical sense that this exists, more as a normative ideal. But as I say, I use that example from the British Gallery, right? And I don't think the British Gallery would use the term post-secular, but here you have, in this most secular of contexts, Britain, London, the seat of power, having an exhibition celebrating a Catholic saint. I mean, that in itself is stunning to me. Not that I don't want to overstate it, but it's the Anglican Church. It's so this Catholic saint here, to retrieve this person as such an icon for today, for all the problems of the world today. But your question, I think, needs to be, you can answer it in all kinds of ways, that it is the normative ideal, but I prefer to think of it that post-secular society is here, because there's lots of, Pope Francis exemplifies it. As I say, he doesn't necessarily think of himself as a post-secular thinker or actor, but all of his major encyclicals are on things that are about the world. They're not about, he hasn't written an encyclical, to many people's disappointment, on women, or on these issues that have always agitated Catholics, but he's really coming down in that long history of of social justice, looking at poverty, and now climate change, and intermixing the two. So he's really saying, I'm bringing the secular into my arguments, and you need to bring the religious ethics I'm articulating here into your discussion to find us a way forward. So that's how I answer it. And Pat, sorry, yeah. I'm not moderating, Chris is. Pat had her hand up.
She did not have her hand up.
Okay, sorry. Oh, I thought you were.
Thank you for your talk, Michelle. I had a question. So when you were talking about the role of the Catholic Church in a post-secular society, I thought a lot about
Oh, right.
when you were giving your talk, I thought about Quebec society and the legacy of Catholicism in that society, and how we see the remnants of a collectivistic religious orientation in modern life in Quebec. So if we look at public spending in Quebec, it's much higher. They carry a lot more debt because of those public expenses, but in return, people are getting public goods.
Yes.
That's meant for everyone. So I'm just wondering if you had explored Quebec society in your investigation.
Well, I think that's a great question again. And I wrote a little bit long ago about Quebec, because I was looking at it in terms of secularization and comparing it, I think, to Ireland. Or I was a commentator on looking at America, Ireland, and Quebec. So I really don't know very much really about what's going on detailed-wise in Quebec. I think the Catholic Church was extremely iconically, and still is iconically powerful, even as those iconic churches are empty. But I think Canada, too, is a very different country, let's say, than the US, right? Where there is much more of a communal-driven understanding that there is a public good. And so Canada might have had that or would have had it anyway, I think, without the Catholicism in Quebec, right? Now, the question would be, is Quebec on some higher scale of producing for the public good than Saskatchewan or some that have less the Catholic influence? So I know today I'm focusing on Catholicism, but I must say Catholicism is the only post-secular religion, right? Lots of Protestant and other traditions have many of these same ethics. What I would argue is that the Catholic Church has always been more to the forefront of articulating the commitment of the state and of individuals to the common good. And that's why I go back to the long history of the papal encyclicals. And so I guess those ideals got, to some extent, institutionalized along with the political ideals in Quebec. And so then even as the church declined and, really it became a quite secular society, people had been brought up to believe in a public good. And so that's the sort of the ongoing generative power of religion, even as the religious institution maybe is less visible. But I don't know how extensive Catholic charities are, or the equivalent of that in Quebec or across the different provinces. Because that's a reminder to people that the Catholic Church, in the US, the Catholic Church is the biggest non-state provider of social services. That's huge. So you see Catholic charities everywhere. They're really at the forefront. So whether you're Catholic or not, presumably people must wonder, what is this Catholic charities? And so even if people are not going to church or know who it is, it kind of keeps that imagery alive. But so I'd like to know more about Quebec today, and then how, because it is, I know, very distinct to the rest of Canada for all kinds of reasons, but how that plays out in terms of the public good and the role of Catholicism in it. Yeah. Yes, that's his question.
So obviously the sort of the tension between Pope Francis. More to the mic. Is that better? Okay. Obviously the tension between Pope Francis and local bishops or local sort of church communities in certain national contexts is well documented, well publicized. But that bright green slide that you had near the end of your talk, where you highlighted the percentage of American Catholics' views on climate change, it seems to highlight for us a potential weakness of the Catholic Church as an effective actor in a post-secular context. It seems to be evidence of the fact that there are certain kinds of identity categories that are more salient, that are activated on some of the most pressing questions. And I wonder if that's a tension that sort of an individual like Francis can transcend somehow. Is there a way to activate sort of a potential Catholic identity that emphasizes the common good over sort of a political or national identity that seems to lead to a different result, right? And the idea,
Yes.
and I think sort of, and now I'm a historian, so I'm sort of interested in
Yes.
sort of things that lead into this. The idea that the Catholic Church as a transnational actor is really important, but of course it's also a collection of sort of national churches with national conferences, and it's been that way for, I think about France in the 17th century, debates between Gallicanism and Transmontanism and all of these things, and this is an ongoing tension
Yes.
in terms of the Catholic Church. And I wonder, is there a way in our context for Francis or for some other pope or some other actor within the Catholic Church to transcend this particular tension?
Yeah, well, I think that's why I felt, in all honesty, I had to put up that slide in case you think it's all beauty, that that's the sad thing, or not sad, but the reception of anything, right? You might think, oh, this is a wonderful ad for something, but then no one buys the product, right? I still think that the discourse matters, and I think historically, for the record, just as I keep going back to the papal encyclicals, I mean, it's really fascinating to me to think back that in the late 19th century, each pope, one after another, was radically calling out the sins, we'll say, of industrialization, when they didn't have to do that, but they did. And so I, in that sense, have hope that these encyclicals, even if, and right now, it's not if, but there's a lot of animosity of a lot of bishops towards Pope Francis, but nonetheless, I think the documents are there, and that maybe after Francis is no longer Pope or the next Pope or whatever, those documents will come to have greater salience maybe for different people. That might be a little naive, but I do think this, this is where the bishops too, and it's not really have to also examine their conscience, right, and be, that it's sad really, I suppose, to see that there's so much partisanship, and it's really come out during Francis's papacy. On the one hand, I suppose it can be refreshing because it shows that we all know for a long time that Catholics are not a monolith, that there's a lot of variation of opinion among Catholics on whatever the issue is, which is to me a good thing. But what this has shown for the last few years is that even bishops disagree, which of course we don't like to see the sort of the polarization it's causing, but it's still good for ordinary Catholics to recognize, well, it's not all locked up what the doctrine is, that even if bishops can disagree, like we just saw recently with Cardinal McElroy, for example, as opposed to some of the others. Now the challenge, of course, is these data, right? What can you do about that? And I think this is where the power of the local people can matter, that if you can change hearts and minds, which is never, or not always a good strategy either, but that at the local level, that if local constituents are saying to their priest or their politician, look, you really do have to attack climate change. And if you look, the Republicans actually, they went down a cent, but I think that's in the last 10 years rather than going up 2% or whatever. But there has been shift on climate change, right? We know that, and I don't have that slide here, but that even Republicans, for example, and Catholic Republicans now, on some of the other questions, see that you have to maybe do something about it. And so it's a small change, but I think you have to keep doing it. The transnational piece, some would argue that the transnational piece is what's holding up the church making changes on sex and gender, for example. And yet it's the transnational that also the Latin America and Africa that can be pushing on the environmentalism and economic change. And I suppose, without being partisan, my own view would be that probably it's more important for us to fix the climate and economic inequality, because that really does impact the whole world. Whereas some of those sex and gender items, and I shouldn't call them items, but issues, could be resolved at a local level, right? Which to some extent they are, certainly with gay inclusion. There's some churches that are totally accepting of gays in a very positive way, and others in the same town that mightn't be. But so it's not the ideal answer to that situation either. And of course the women's issue is very different. On women's ordination, would it be fine to have women priests in North America and Europe and not have women priests in Africa, right? That certainly would change what we normally come to think of as the universalism of the Mass, which most Catholics appreciate, that no matter what country you're in and what language is being used, you're still enjoying the same Mass. That might be a little bit of difference that women are here. So, but to me, they're almost more localized issues, even though they're very important to the coherence and the consistency of being Catholic, than these common good issues ultimately of poverty, climate change, etc. So, the national conferences of bishops, I used to think that they were a good thing, because it meant that the bishops within a one region or nation had to come together for dialogue, whereas you see it more of sort of partisan nationalisms.
I don't necessarily
See it, but no, it's a good thing to think about, yeah. Well, it is, no, thank you. No, there's a lot for me to think about, yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for your lecture. I'm wondering if you've looked at all at the bit of a movement in political philosophy of integralism or towards an integralism and sort of a reassertion of the church's political authority and the common good constitutionalism legal philosophy being developed by Harvard law professor Adrian Vermeule. And I mean, these movements seem to have some resonance with what you're talking about, while at the same time not really being well aligned necessarily with the same emphases as Pope Francis. I'm just wondering if you've looked at those or have any comment on them.
Well, again, that's another great question. Are you a philosopher?
I'm a law professor.
Or law professor? Well, I always like to say that I'm a sociologist, so we're beholden to philosophy, but there's a reason why I became a sociologist, was to look at the realities, the empiricism, or to some extent. Yes, I'm familiar with integralism, and I think there's a resurgence of integralist productivity and intellectual activity in that regard. My limited understanding is that it is distinctly different from the post-secular ideals, and this goes back to the question of post-secular as a normative rather than an empirical reality, that the integralism, in a sense, doesn't have the openness, but I might be wrong, so that's why, that it doesn't have the same openness to the modern that the integralists would want. But that's my limited understanding of that. And so to me, what's valuable about the post-secular is this openness to arguments that you really don't want to hear, but now you really do want to hear because you have an ethical obligation to reconsider one's position. So that's the way I would see it, but I recognize I'm speaking about the integralism from a very limited understanding of it. And then, of course, it also begs the question, if you're open to things, where do you draw the line, right? And that's always a tension, and that's a tension, certainly, as we see with Francis, that he draws lines on some of the, like gays and women, whereas much more open on some of the other issues. And that always has been an issue within Catholicism, you know, what's core to the tradition, what's essential, and what's secondary or less essential. And we've never really talked about that. And on that issue, for example, on women's ordination, one could say perhaps that I would say that it's more important in terms of the catechism and the church teaching that Mass be celebrated, and that it's less essential whether that's a man or a woman. Now, a lot of people would disagree with that, including the Catholic Church, most Catholic leaders. But what really is the essence? If you can't have no Mass and no consecrated Eucharist, so that you can honor the fact that you have no male priests to celebrate the Mass, is that what you should do, or should you be open to the fact that you could have the consecrated sacrament if you allowed women to do it? So that's the question that obviously some synod needs to talk about, I suppose. But I think you have to think beyond what you're, and I'm saying that's my opinion, but I'm sure there's lots of opinions that obviously would dissuade me or could dissuade me.
Okay, so we'll give Monica the last question.
Michele, when you were talking about the role of post-secularism and the role of the Catholic Church, I was reminded of corporate power, because you were talking about the threats of neoliberalism
Yes.
and massive state deregulation of corporate practices and corporations, and we live in a time where corporations have been able to consolidate their corporate power.
Yes.
And I think a primary mechanism by which they've been able to do that successfully is to present themselves as a cohesive group by engaging in larger questions outside of business. So we look to business leaders for direction on education, on philanthropy. So I was wondering whether maybe part of the solution is a rebranding of the Catholic message by making it modern, even if they're not able to fulfill the promises of being actively engaged in new social movements on the questions of homosexuality, on birth control. Maybe it's tweaking the message to make it more palatable and also to make them more visible as leaders on these questions.
Well, excellent. Maybe that's what I'm saying, like my point about the religiously unaffiliated. Religiously unaffiliated people are not looking, I don't think, to read Catholic encyclicals, but if they read and paid attention to Pope Francis on the environment, they'd all be signing up to come, at least to meet with him, or maybe not to come to Mass, but so that would be your rebranding. I mean, it is perhaps unfortunate that over the last, really since 1968 in Humanae Vitae, that so much in the Western world of Catholicism has focused on contraception, sexuality, and that has driven, we have that evidence, has driven people away from the church. And so the rebranding would be a good strategy, but I think to some extent Francis has rebranded the church, even though we don't see the evidence of the return to church. So that's the complicated, but yeah, maybe you should write to someone in Rome. But as we all know, even in education, trying to rebrand who it is and what we do and what differentiates us doesn't always help. But I think it's unfortunate that the sex and gender have become so that a lot of Catholic young people can't understand why would someone be Catholic if the church believes this and that about whether it's women or gays or whatever. Whereas if you could talk to them instead about what the church says on economic justice, climate change, I mean, it's a very radical set of statements. I mean, they're almost too radical, because they're really asking people to not be the consumers that we are. But thank you. Yeah, it's good. Oh, I'm getting.
Just a word of thanks, Michele, for such an uplifting and energizing lecture tonight. And you talked about political polarization as evidence of a paucity of reflection, but I think tonight that has not been the case at all. There's been a lot of reflection, a lot to reflect on, and so I thank you for that. You've given us a very hopeful vision of the way that secularism and religious discourse can have a conversation together in a public space. And you've given us hope that religion could remain relevant and indeed a guiding star to help orient secular society to a more ethical future. So on behalf of St. Thomas More College, thank you for coming to Saskatoon. Thank you for such a delightful lecture.
Thank you all. It's very good. No, thank you. Thank you. It's lovely. No, this, well, thank you all. Well, thank you all very much again. And it's, thank you.
And just a brief word that there is going to be a reception down